This is Edge Perspectives, a weekly conversation about the biggest insights that span healthcare market intelligence, quality, and operations with the Vizient Strategy Intelligence team and other experts.
It ultimately comes into your capacity and ability to provide access or not. We're building that into our forecasts and others, but labor has not gone away. It's still over half of our expense base. We need people to deliver care.
Hello and welcome to Edge Perspectives. I'm your host, Tori Richie. Today, we are joined by two of our experts, Sushma Narra and Brian Esser, and we are going to talk all things economic index. Sushma, Brian, so glad to have you here. Sushma, can you give listeners an overview of the economic index? What is it? How should health systems use it?
The economic index, we're in our fourth iteration of it now. We decided to create this index to capture your market signals. We wanted to create an overarching index that tracked population growth, demand forecasts, a lot of the activities that you might have been doing in isolation. Instead, we created this index to track market performance that's shaped with the interaction of several domains. So we have demographics, insurance coverage dynamics, reimbursement, and how that affects your markets. We also have a unique input this year about labor availability. And then we also incorporated a lot of economic conditions like GDP growth, some climate change factors, et cetera, that will ultimately change or alter your future financial sustainability.
What are the types of questions that can be answered leveraging the economic index?
A major question that folks ask is, how localized should my strategy be? And we've found that strategy needs to be local. It needs to be very specific to your market dynamics today. And the biggest change that we made this year is that labor piece. We have a lot of demand potentially in your market, but how can you actually sustain the demand? Because healthcare is a service industry. The labor availability in forthcoming years will alter your ability to provide the care that the population needs.
This is the fourth iteration of the economic index. Were there any surprises in the outputs this year?
This year in specific, we saw about a third of 8 hospital service areas shifting from that stable sector from last year to more shrinking. This isn't as surprising as we thought. However, we noted that most of this map is now becoming that flatter shrinking dynamic attributed to 3 drivers: Medicaid enrollment changes, specifically declines, with a pairing of growth in uninsured populations, underlying payer mix deterioration. So thinking about the growth of Medicare Advantage and how that's putting pressure, and then commercial growth across the country is pretty flat. All of those resulted in a more flat or shrinking map.
Brian, you spend a lot of time interacting with C-suite members within health systems. I'm curious, was the latest update of the economic index validating with some of those conversations over the last year or so?
Yes, it is, because a lot of the metrics are things that are happening outside the 4 walls of the hospital or the health system. Things that the leadership knows are simmering maybe under the surface economically within the market, but it may not be something that they track day to day on their traditional lists of KPIs. Everything that our forecast teams does on demand and trying to understand where that's coming from is critical and important, but we need to also put that in context of what's happening within the market itself. Sushma talked about demographics. We see that happening. Folks have a good sense of that. But as we get further away from the traditional metrics of coverage into some of these market-based environments around housing affordability, vulnerability, climate dynamics, it begins to speak to the consumer side of the equation and pocketbook issues that the consumers are wrestling with that may limit their ability to engage in healthcare in as meaningful a way and spend the healthcare dollar as meaningfully as they did in the past. It's validating to a degree, and it's also saying where could those external pressure points disrupt the demand that we are expecting or forecasting moving forward.
I love that. And in practice, do you have any thoughts or words of wisdom for health system leaders who perhaps their systems do span multiple different types of markets? And how does a system strategy differ in a growth market versus in a shrinking one? How then should health system leaders be navigating how you fine-tune your approach in those very different markets based on the signals that exist?
Not all systems are operating in a single market archetype. I wish we were all in growth markets. We'd have no problems, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Most systems are saying, hey, I have a portfolio of assets that are going to sit in some growth markets, some markets that are more challenged, and some that are truly deteriorating quicker than we thought. They need to understand the operational rigor is different in the levers they pull when it comes to revenue quality, costs and optimization, and even just access points and capacity need to reflect some of that market nuance as they're deploying their strategic thinking. We went back to the original publication of the index itself and built out these 4 quadrants of what they should do and what strategic levers to pull. And we compare the economic index, whether you're in a strengthening or deteriorating market, but also compare that to organizations' financial health. Are you strong or weak financially? And as you think about that 2x2 that is produced, you have those in the upper quadrant, really strong markets, really strong financially. They have the flexibility and probably the capital capacity and margin resiliency to innovate more so and take bigger chances and more risks to push the care engine forward in novel ways versus markets that might be deteriorating and the financial strength is fairly weak for an organization. Lots of defense. You're probably selecting where to focus, probably rationalizing services, thinking about partnerships more advanced or robustly. And where you fall on those 2 spectrums dictate where you need to focus your overall strategic planning capacity.
And Brian, with that original publication we produced years ago, these 3 levers remain evergreen. One is to think about revenue quality and how you can differentiate in your market.
Sushma, in some of the research to build out this body of work and validate the outputs of the economic index, have you come across any examples of organizations that are succeeding within their markets despite some turbulent environments?
There's a system in Southwestern Ohio that increased their credit rating from A1 to A2 per Moody's. This system in particular, Ohio is declining overall as a state, but then specifically in Southwest Ohio, they've seen dramatic population declines, shrinking commercial base, and also increased Medicare Advantage growth. We saw that this organization was pretty impressive because they're not operating in a fast-growing market, but they've consistently used operational rigor and leveraged their physician alignment, their network development within the community. They've been growing ambulatory access and have now very strong community positioning to outperform the market fundamentals that we've seen in that region.
That just goes to demonstrate that where you are physically located doesn't necessarily mean that you're not able to achieve success to ensure that you're optimizing growth and operations and ensuring your solvency long term.
On top of that, we're operating under a mission. We've been in that mode, if not decades, centuries. Some of our organizations are over 100 years old. You can't pick up and move the hospital to a better market, and that's not what we're expecting. But that's really the goal here, is continue that nonprofit mission perspective. We need to be aware of all the headwinds, the ones we know of, the ones that might be simmering under the surface, and let's put your organization in a position to succeed moving forward. So that's really the goal of the tool.
2 is to control costs, and 3 is to optimize capacity. As you think about that 2x2 framework, it's which 1 or 2 of these 3 should you be prioritizing given your market circumstance.
I really like that, Sushma. Brian, as you talked through those different strategic levers, I am reminded of something that Lisa Goldstein said last week at the Vizient Executive Strategy Summit. The next 2 years dictate the coming decade. And your strategy for growth or even sustainability is going to look quite different depending on where you fall along that 2x2, but making sure that you are holding yourself accountable and working toward achieving that goal of solvency so that over the next 2 years, you do set yourself up for success for the next decade. And success is going to look quite different depending on who you are and the type of markets that you're in.
That's exactly it. Lisa's always fantastic. To her point, success is key and cash ultimately is king. To get that margin into the positive range and have enough cash to sustain operations, we need to be aware of not only the demand, which our team has always helped and encouraged you to focus on, but all the externalities that are going to be challenging you operationally. That's really what this index is designed to do. Sushma and I talked about the original publication, and a lot of this is evergreen, but then you add in things like AI, which is newer since the publication came out. Where does that land on your productivity and how does that enhance it or not? What's the cost of deploying that? And can you absorb that cost real time over the next 2 years to remain competitive? And even the demographic discussion. We put this out, and Tori, we go back and forth on this on the insurance forecast discussions. But the aging markets, it's not just payer mix and how they're paying and what your population looks like. There's also a labor perspective here. And we've added a new metric as the potential support ratio, because I heard this in one of the bond rating calls. Where are these markets that are so unaffordable to live in and aging rather aggressively? Can your labor pool even live approximately close to where you need them to live? When does that start to spiral wage costs upwards as you're trying to attract labor as folks are retiring out? These are the questions you want to be ahead of over the next 3 to 5 years in particular.
And also note that the US population grew in 2025. It's the slowest growth since 2021. It only grew about 0.5%. Thinking about that labor dynamic is more important in today's environment than it was in years past. And what we incorporated was thinking about the current working age adults relative to the non-working adults. That is the ratio Brian described. A market can have that economic growth, but if it doesn't have workforce sustainability into the future, growth becomes extremely difficult to capture.
That's fair. Do you think labor availability could become even more important of a predictor of success for markets than population growth? This idea of you can have all the demand that you want, but if you don't have the labor to support, what do you do?
It's a classic. It ultimately comes into your capacity and ability to provide access or not. We're building that into our forecasts and others, but labor has not gone away. It's still over half of our expense base. We need people to deliver care. And as that labor pool continues to be challenged, if it gets more challenged in certain markets, if you're unaware of that, you have a dearth of labor on supply side and potentially a rate limiter on your ability to grow. We need to be cognizant. And if the overall labor pool is tight, we are not the only industry that needs labor, and the competition across industry is likely to skyrocket.
And I'll also add to that, there's innovation opportunities within that labor pool too. With the increased adoption of AI, how can you think about labor a little differently in certain areas of your business and not necessarily over leverage your attention on securing human capital?
Within the economic index, there are 4 different segments that a market can be categorized. Sushma, could you distinguish what separates a strong growth market from moderate, from limited, from flat or shrinking? What are some of those signals that's going to differentiate markets from one another based on those segments?
High-performing markets have about 4 to 5 common characteristics. One of them is population growth. So this is the most weighted metric within our tool. We see population growth booming in certain areas across the country, specifically Dallas, Austin, Boise, some areas in the South like Atlanta. So that's one predictor. We also have growing commercially insured population. And we would argue that this might be more important than population growth alone because not all population growth will sustain your business. And financial performance may then deteriorate if that population growth isn't concentrated necessarily in commercials. And then we also have labor availability as the buoy that helps differentiate your market because we're noticing that strong markets generally have larger working age populations. The national median is around 2.6. So that means about 2.6 working age adults to every 1 retiree. This builds more sustainable workforce pipelines into the future. And then the 4th common characteristic is that GDP and economic growth. Strong markets tend to have a lot more job creation, business investments, diversified economies where health systems can reach out to employers directly and build unique contracts. GDP growth is a key characteristic that underlies market attractiveness as well. From a low performing market, a lot of these are the opposite of what I described, but we've also just seen a lot more vulnerability in a social context. So the Vizient Vulnerability Index, this applies obviously a lot more social risks and greater reimbursement pressures overall. When we see all of these characteristics aligning, we see a lot more markets rise to the top.
Of the market signals that you just described, which do you think health system leaders aren't paying close enough attention to?
The index helps to blend all of these externalities that you might not be paying attention to. Specifically, health system leaders might not be paying enough attention to their labor pipeline into the future rather than just looking at today and the economic indicators within their individual market. Are we looking at diversifying business and thinking about how potential new investment opportunities like data centers within your community will help bolster some of your population growth and demand?
Brian, from your purview, what is one thing that you hope strategy leaders do differently after reviewing this year's refresh of the economic index, besides just taking a more comprehensive approach to decision making?
Do different. The power of the index is interesting to see, where does your market compare to others? Everyone likes to see that comparison point. The interesting thing is smashing some of these metrics together. So we talked about labor supply versus affordability on the housing, and what will that do? I'm thinking about insurance enrollment trends coupled with that payer concentration. We talked about this earlier this year, and who's in or out of MA on the payer side, and what does that do to disrupt coverage? So when we talked about GDP, if you're concentrated on one big employer industry in your market and that industry gets interrupted by any host of reasons, what does that do to your commercial base and really to the uninsured? So it's getting a sense of, where do I have overexposure externally, that if something would happen, have I modeled that out and scenario planned effectively enough, or will we be caught unaware or flat-footed? And it's those things that we may not always be paying attention to that we just need to be more aware of. We can't have any surprises going forward. Basically, as you said, the next 2 years are critical to getting that sustainable financial footprint established or not. The other thing is, who else is doing well in markets that are similar? And this question has come up a few times over the last month or so. Folks saying, I'm in one of these markets that might be somewhat stable, but trending downward for whatever reason. Who else looks like me on a market basis? And then who is doing well despite some of these headwinds? And what can we learn from that? Using it as a comparison and a peer engagement tool. And how do I learn from others that maybe even further down this deterioration path, but still had the rigor and the blocking and tackling skills to maintain a sustainable enterprise? We need to really understand, who are those best practices.
Sushma, if folks want to learn more about the economic index or roll up their sleeves and actually dive into the data, how do they access that information?
We've made it a lot easier this year. On the website, you'll see the link to the expert insight, which we detail the tool and more regional trends that we've noticed. And then at the bottom of that, you'll see an interactive Power BI dashboard where folks can dig in to the tool itself and isolate their states or regions and understand more behind the domains of the overall index.
Awesome. Sushma, Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for listening to this episode of Edge Perspectives, a podcast from Vizient. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, please reach out to us using the email address in the show notes.